Good morning. Simran, do you want to open the session?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. So we're going to talk to you guys today about emotional intelligence, building EI within your team. So my name is Simran Buttar. I'm ultrasound faculty in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Maimonides Medical Center. I also did an education fellowship at Thomas Jefferson University.
Simran, I'm being told you need to use a mic.
Oh, okay.
And my name is Dimitrios Papanagnou. I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Jefferson, where I'm also the Vice Chair of Education. And in the medical school, I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty Development. I see they gave us 20 minutes to talk about EQ, or EI, or emotional intelligence. And we can talk about this for days. But our goal today is to give you some very finite tools that you can start using today and bring to your teams next week when you get back home.
So the goal for this talk for us is we really want you guys to leave convinced that EI is important in terms of how you work with your teams. This is the outline for our talk. First, we're going to give you some basic terminology. Then we're going to give you a case for emotional intelligence, both for leaders and for teams, and a simple framework for regulating emotion. And then finally, we're going to talk about why this is going to help your individual team succeed. So what is EI? What is EQ? So emotional intelligence is a set of emotional and social skills that collectively establish how well we perceive and express ourselves, how we develop and maintain social relationships, how we cope with challenges, and how we use emotional information in effective ways. In the 1990s, Daniel Goleman put together a bunch of research and defined emotional intelligence for us. He gave us these 5 components to focus on. So the first 3 components focus on the self. These are things that you can do to improve your emotional intelligence. Self-awareness, self-management, and motivation. The last 2 have more to do with your interpersonal relationships. This is empathy and social skills.
So Simran, if I can interject there, I think this previous slide is just very nitty-gritty, very caught in the weeds. When I think about these things, I like a nice conceptual framework to really convey that information in a couple of sentences. And that's why I love this diagram. So I want you to close your eyes, some visual imagery here, and think about yourselves driving to work on a Monday morning. Okay? There's a witching hour at 6:45. So if you're not on the road by 6:45, every minute that you're late, you're incrementally late by 10 minutes. Okay? As you're getting there, you're doing well, somebody cuts you off. You're now stuck, you're delayed 5 minutes, you're not going to make that meeting at 7:30, and you're angry, you're pissed, you're feeling a flight of emotions. Think authentically, what are you likely to do? How are you likely to respond in that particular moment? Some of the decisions that you'll make are likely not favorable, will likely not yield to a positive outcome. Maybe a hand gesture, maybe a profanity, likely just a honk on the horn. The truth of the matter is, the way that we behave is emotional intelligence. And the best way for me to convey to you what emotional intelligence is this connection between the frontal lobe and the limbic system. The limbic system is the reptilian brain, the amygdala, our flight or fight response, right? It is that part of the brain that reacts based on emotion to give that individual the finger or to yell a profanity. Sorry if I'm being profane right now. But this can be developed. So emotional intelligence is the ability for that frontal lobe, for our cognition, to prevent that amygdala hijack. And the amygdala hijack is something that comes up a lot in the emotional intelligence literature. So I'm an EQ nerd myself. I'm in the last stages of a doctorate in education. This happens to be my dissertation and looking at EQ development in residents, in emergency medicine residents particularly. So when I convey emotional intelligence, I like to use this model because I think it really succinctly explains what emotional intelligence is. By developing this connection, we're more in tune with our emotions. We're more in tune with how we express those emotions. We're more in tune with how those emotions impact the interpersonal relationships we have, and as a result, impact the decisions we make to act. Any questions about that? So that's essentially the premise of EI or EQ which essentially are used interchangeably. How many of you have seen this picture before? Right? So IQ is what we see, the benchmarks, the metrics, the USMLE scores. I like the phrase, IQ gets you the job. It's EQ that ensures that you keep the job and get promoted. It's EQ, however, that we do not see. It is invisible to the naked eye. IQ and IQ metrics are easy to screen, but medicine and healthcare is learning from the organizational psychology world, and we're now beginning to use EQ tests and EQ indices to accept students into medical school, to use EQ to influence the way that we interview resident candidates to assess specific EI competencies. When we talk about EQ, I hear a lot of people talking about IQ and personality, and sometimes use them interchangeably. EQ we spoke about. IQ we alluded to. Cognition, your aptitude, usually peaks around the age of 18. Personality is very different. Personality is not EQ. Personality is just a set of preferences with how we like to live our lives. Are we extroverted or introverted? How do we make decisions? Do we rely on our intuition or do we need information? How do we approach life? How do we approach deadlines? Do we wait for the last minute or do we plan weeks in advance? Now, these preferences can change as we get older, as we progress through life, but personality really denotes that constellation of preferences that we have about ourselves and about being immersed in the world. Some psychologists would argue that personality is fixed. With some therapy, with some work, those preferences might change, but there are preferences, and it's really hard to change our preferences because they're hardwired. IQ, as I mentioned earlier, is fixed. EQ, however, that skill for us to use our emotions in a positive way to make decisions that will yield more productive outcomes, both for ourselves and for our team, fortunately can be developed. EQ peaks around the age of 40, which is good. Or, there's 40, 50, the evidence is conflicting. But by today's session, we are going to give you a framework, an activity that you can do day in and day out to help develop that muscle memory, to develop that skill. If you want to develop muscle mass, you go to the gym. If you want to develop EQ, you need to do some reflection. And we're going to introduce you a framework, which I think is fun, which I learned in graduate school, which I will share with you today.
Emotional intelligence is twice as important as technical skills or IQ. So most of you in the room are emergency medicine providers or medical students. So you have the technical skills or the IQ. The next step in terms of being successful in your career or making changes in the world, this is emotional intelligence. This is how we develop leaders in our field. So why should we care? We should care about EQ because it's the single best predictor of workplace performance. It accounts for 58% of performance in all jobs. It's the strongest driver of leadership, and 90% of performers have high EQs. So we don't want you to leave this talk thinking EQ is everything when it comes to your teams, but we want you to leave thinking that by developing EQ, you could be better physicians, better leaders, better team members. So transition to leadership. What do the best leaders have in common? So there's a lot of different types of leaders. Leaders can be extroverts, leaders can be introverts. Every different type of scenario calls for a different type of leader. However, one thing that many of these leaders have in common is that they have a high EQ.
So why should we care now? How many of you have heard EQ and EI emerge a lot in the literature, in conversations, in the workplace? Right? I think this is something that we're becoming more cognizant of. And leave it to healthcare, leave it to medicine to catch up later than all the other fields. But why is it trending? Well, emotional contagion is really important. Right? We know about contagion of diseases, but emotions are contagious. Emotions are infectious. Different Monday morning. You've had a wonderful weekend. You're so happy. You had a chance to sleep late. You spent time with your family. You had some great food and some great dinners, and now you're in the office and you're in a great mood. And as you're walking into your office, to kind of put down your bag this week and go to your emergency medicine shift, you run into that individual that maybe is kind of toxic 80% of the time. They're grumbling to you. They're talking to you. They're complaining. They're giving their gripes to you. And they walk away several minutes later after a dialogue And now you feel that you've sort of internalized those emotions. It happens all the time. This is emotional contagion. We need to understand that the emotions that we bring with us day in and day out to our teams will impact our teams. Think about this in the clinical learning environment. Think about this in the ED. As team leaders, as the attending of record, or maybe the senior resident, you're really setting the stage. Your emotions and the emotions that you're conveying have an impact on your team. So it's trending now because I think the literature is supporting the importance of emotional contagion. That's number one. Number two, how are we assessing competencies in our residents? I mean, take a look at the 6 core competencies: patient care, interpersonal skills, communication skills, professionalism. I mean, the literature is replete with how EQ and how the integration of emotions into a positive way can impact all of these competencies. What about wellness? There's been some recent literature to suggest that emotional intelligence can predict wellness. We had a hypothesis at Jefferson. We wanted to see if residency was a primer to help develop emotional intelligence in our residents. Do third-year residents have higher EQs than their interns? That was our hypothesis. It's a natural hypothesis. It's supported in organizational literature, but it wasn't true for our cohort, and we repeated this several times. There was not a linear relationship seen between PGY1, PGY2, PGY3, and this was replicated several times. Obviously, a limitation here is our sample size, which is really small, but what we have seen every year is that PGY2s are statistically significantly lower in their overall EQ from their intern counterparts and their senior counterparts, without fail, every year. And when you dig deeper, so these are the major competencies that Simran alluded to before, but when you break these down, these are the specific skills that predict EQ. And where do our PGY2 residents suffer? Massively low scores in self-regard, massively low scores in self-expression, emotional expression, in their assertiveness, stress tolerance. One thing that needs to be highlighted here that has not been is optimism. Think about the milieu in your respective departments. Think about that transition point. What happens for that PGY2 resident? We talk about wellness initiatives. We talk about targeting wellness initiatives. I think this is a great primer. EQ is a great vehicle for us to find out how we can best be prepared to address wellness in our resident cohorts. So we spoke about EQ on a micro level. Let's now shift to the team level, and for this, I'll hand this back to Simran.
Okay, so EI is critical to have a successful team. So how do you stop your team from failing? We think it's by establishing stronger EI. How do we establish high-performing teams? First, you want to think about improving your team's emotional intelligence. You also want to think about improving the individual emotional intelligence of the members of your team.
So to recap, if you want to address team EI, we need to invest in team member EI development. And this is where I mentioned earlier we'd introduce you to a framework. How many of you have heard of the ORID framework? Nobody? So the ORID framework is something that organizations use to train their employees in customer service, in relations, in psychology. We'll talk about what each of those stand for. But before that, think about how you make decisions. Let's go back to that scenario on the highway where you're being cut off. You're processing so much information. You're processing objective information, right? Somebody drove in front of you. You're processing reflective information, the fact that you're pissed and angry. You're processing interpretive information. As human beings, we create a narrative around everything. If we send a text message to somebody and they're not replying, or we see those 3 little dots and they're going and there's no text message coming, we're creating a narrative in our heads. Were they disappointed by my text message? Did I say something offensive? Are they busy? That's how we work. We've been creating narratives ever since the dawn of time to make sense of the world around us. And then we're processing decisional information. What do we do? How do we act? So think about that instance. When you were cut off in that very minute, from the moment that experience, from the moment that event happened, how long did it take for you to generate that response? probably seconds. And that's because when we think about this information, all this information is flowing in our heads like crazy, which can be confusing. This is my dog, Rudy, and he's not in here because he just looks confused and he looks perplexed, but he's going to make a cameo in the presentation very shortly. So I love this figure, right? So we spoke about the 4 types of information that we're processing. Objective information. This is information that's coming in from the senses, things that we see, things that we hear. We're not talking about interpreting those. So when I mentioned that that person cut me off, is that objective information? This is a small group. Is that, would me making the assumption, would me saying that this individual cut me off on the highway, is that objective data? I'm interpreting it. So can you give me an example about what some objective data would be from that event, from that experience? If I wanted to really process it, if I was being metacognitive and pausing myself and pausing this sort of arc that bypasses the frontal lobe and goes straight to the amygdala.
Someone changed lanes too close to you.
Someone changed lanes. They happened to be in the lane right next to me, and they happened to change lanes in a speed that was faster than the speed at which I was driving. Great. So that's where we're thinking with our senses. That information is coming to us from our senses, right? But most of the time, it's so hard for us to stop making meaning around that information that's coming in. The R is easy. Those are the thoughts that we're processing right here, actually kind of right here in your gut, right? Those emotions, those strong emotions, those fight or flight reactions. The brain, however, is making these really quick decisions and doesn't really rely on the fact that you're not processing this information objectively, and it's being clouded by your emotions. It's being clouded by your amygdala. If you take the time to really process these data and to think about the bias, the enormous bias that R poses, you're more likely to get the decisional information and react more appropriately. Another slide, again, conveying the same thing. We take in information, we make sense of it, and we move to action. Oftentimes, however, we go straight from taking information and moving to action, right? We're letting emotion sometimes bypass us. Questions to help us be a little bit metacognitive, to help us pause, and this takes time, right? If you're a big fan of Daniel Kahneman, great New York Times bestseller, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, Type 1 thinking, Type 2 thinking. As emergency medicine physicians, we are trained to develop that Type 1 thinking to make decisions quickly. Type 2 thinking takes a long time. It's more deliberate. We can't thrive in a world where we're always employing Type 2 thinking, but we should probably be cognitive as to when and where Type 2 thinking or applying the ORID framework is appropriate. O, what is happening? Am I looking at this objectively? Am I making sure that I'm not interpreting any of this information that's coming in? Okay, great. R, how am I feeling about this? How am I reacting to this? I'm getting tachycardic. I'm getting angry. My fists are getting clenched. Okay, great. Maybe this is not the best time for me to send that email right now. Maybe I should draft that email, put it away in my outbox, and I'll send that tomorrow morning after I read it again to let those emotions diffuse. Then you give your brain the time to think about the meaning and the narrative that you're carving out and to sort of think, is this making sense? And hopefully that will give you decisional information to tell you what to do, and to respond. So we go back to Rudy. Rudy's my dog. Again, I love this visual imagery thing. So you can close your eyes, you can keep your eyes open. All of you are dog lovers. You love dogs. You can love cats too, but you love dogs more. You have a Boston Terrier, okay? And you walk your Boston Terrier every time you wake up in the morning around 6:30 in the morning, okay? So I love Monday mornings because I think we can really connect to Monday mornings. And again, you're driving to work and you really need to get out of the house by 6:30. It's 6:20. You have 10 minutes to walk Rudy. Okay? So you're ready to go. This is the last thing that's between you and getting into your car with your coffee that's already brewed, that's waiting in your thermos. Okay? So you grab your leash and you try to find Rudy to take him for a walk. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to play a video clip of me in this situation, and I want you to pay attention to this information, but I want you to pay attention to this information using the ORID framework. Okay? Do I have permission? Yes? Are we good? Okay.
Hey, Rudy. Time to go for a walk.
Okay, so we'll pause right there. Okay, so you're in this mode, right? You need to go for a walk. This is happening. Forget about the ORID framework for a second. How would you normally react in a situation like this? What would you do? What would your next reaction be? Get over here, yell. Maybe kind of take your fist and bang it on a table, right? Maybe kind of get under the table, right? And try to catch him and try to corner him, right? Right? Who knows how far this would escalate, right? Because we're getting that amygdala hijack, and all we are thinking about is how late we are going to be, and this experience is in the way of you getting to work on time. But you're now going to become adaptive experts with using the ORID framework. So let's begin with O. What is some objective data that you've captured from this clip? So that's great. Is that, though, objective, or is that interpretation? And that is exactly, this is why I play this clip, that is exactly what happens. We go straight to interpretation. That person doesn't like, we're in a meeting, that person spoke out against my idea because he doesn't like me, and he wants me to fail, right? Happens all the time. But thank you for that, because that normally that is, and that's what I want to elicit. So we agree that that might be sort of on the interpretation level. Okay, what about, give me some objective data. I'm following the dog with a leash. Love it. Great. Anything else? Yes, every time I approach a dog, he's running away from me. Great. Maybe one more piece of information. Is that objective? That's perfect, and that's it. And that's the data we want, right? He's turning back. He's looking at me, right? Every time I pause, he looks back at me, right? So great. So before we get to the interpretation, let's go to the reflection. What's the reflective information that you're gathering from this video? The emotional information that you can kind of sense from me. I'm getting annoyed. How are you feeling if you were sort of putting yourself in this set of shoes? Frustrated, anxious, interpretation. So I think we heard some interpretations. I think we heard game, engagement. What did you say? What was your first comment? He didn't want to go for a walk. What if I told you that Rudy happens to have a toy that's a rope toy that looks exactly like a leash? What if I told you that we also happen to play games where I chase him around? So thinking about this data now can inform decisional information. Now that you have those three pieces of data, how might you inform your action? What would you recommend I do? What was that? Okay. Okay, so hopefully this gives you an idea as to how you can use this framework during those times where you feel that amygdala hijack from happening. If you wanted to try a group exercise, this is something that we did to immerse. Now, taking things on a team level, how many of you know what an escape room is? Right? It's a sadistic thing where people pay people money to lock them up in a room for an hour to have them escape. The truth of the matter is that there's a ton of amygdala hijacking that happens in there, and you can link it. This is our paper. I can share this with you afterwards. But it links to a set of tasks that directly link to ACGME milestones that can be tethered to task switching, interpersonal skills, communication skills. So if you really wanted to focus on an activity that you can actually take home with you, an escape room might be an idea that you want to employ. So moving from the self and back to the team, Simran's going to wrap up and share with us some tangible things that we can take home to our teams to start employing more EI-informed teams.
Okay, so we wanted you guys to leave with some sort of a primer for how to develop a more emotionally intelligent team. So the first thing, this is one of the foundations. We want you to set SMART goals early. What are SMART goals? They're specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, time-bound. When we talk about goals and SMART goals, there's always a good sports analogy. So this is one that I stole from a Coursera that I took on from UPenn on leadership. So the Golden State Warriors in 2014 were not doing so well. They got a new coach named Steve Kerr. He came in and decided to make a change. So he had one suggestion. He said that there were too many turnovers and the team needed to work on how they passed the ball. So he worked on that very basic foundational thing that just we need to pass better. Their goal for the first game was to reduce their number of turnovers. So they did that and they won that first game. They also won the next 20 in a row, and they ended up winning that season. They won the championship. So, again, we don't want you to think win the championship, but think about the one SMART goal that you want to take out of when you're trying to make decisions for your team. Assign team roles. So a lot of you guys are in admin teams, you're in ultrasound teams, you're in education teams. So when you come up with tasks, you have tasks to do research, or you may have tasks to do some sort of educational project, teach a certain group of residents. So we want you to take that task and assign someone who's responsible, who's actually doing the task. The person who's accountable, whose head is gonna roll if this task goes left. The consulted person, who could tell me more about this task, who's a stakeholder, and the informed person, whose work depends on this task, who's your division chair who needs you to finish this ultrasound project. So I also want you to think about the type of rules that your team plays by. Let's say, again, you're on an ultrasound team or an education team. What are the rules that you play by? How do you communicate? Do you text? Do you group me? Do you use Slack? Do you communicate via email? Is everyone on board with this type of communication? Are there a few people who never communicate? How do you make decisions? Do you vote when you make decisions for your team? Or is there a certain group of people who make the decisions? Does the team leader make the decisions? So we want you to go back and think about those things. And how do you handle conflict? We all have conflicts within our groups. How does your team handle when someone doesn't agree with them? So the last point that I want you guys to leave with is I want you to think about your team members and what's in it for them. Why is this person want to do this research project? So me and Dimitri might be on a research project, and we might have different things that we want out of it. We might not necessarily agree on how we want this to develop our career or what we want out of it. So we want you to go back and think about what your team member wants out of these projects that you're working on. Finally, this is something to leave with you guys in case you want to learn more about this. So there's a lot of people in the business world, especially Google, who has thought a lot about developing EI within their teams. They created this program called Search Inside Yourself. It's a book and it's a program. It talks about developing mindfulness within your team. There's a lot of concepts that they go over, like active listening that I don't want to get into, but they have found that they've increased their retention rates and their employee happiness by implementing this. So it's very interesting if you guys want to look more into this. And finally,
so we're a little over, but hopefully we got to explain what EQ and EI is, what personality is and how it differs from personality, introducing a framework that can help us develop and be a little bit more cognizant about EI, and then give you some tangible skills that you can take to your teams to start developing. Thinking about your team members and what's in it for them, establishing the rules of play, whether it's establishing communication pipelines, thinking about how you're going to make decisions, thinking about how you'll handle conflict, and making SMART goals. So with that said, thank you so much. Sorry we went over. Enjoy the rest of the conference.